Welcome back to the channel. My name is Steven. I'm a pharmacist. I'm investing in real estate for 8 years. So today I want to talk about the dark side of working in corporate healthcare that nobody talks about. So if you guys know me, I've been a pharmacist for 13 years and I've been a pharmacy leader for the past 8 years. And I've worked in many hospital settings where they're standalone. They're part of a corporation, so you might have 3 or 4 or 5 sister hospitals. I worked for a hospital that had 50 plus hospitals nationwide. So I feel like I've got a good gamut in terms of like working at standalone hospitals versus working at kind of like small corporation hospitals and working at large corporation hospitals. And I feel qualified to talk about kind of the dark side of working in corporate healthcare to hopefully give you guys some insight as to the back end. And like I said, not many people talk about this. I'll show you kind of the dark side. So let me kind of share, my experience, in the largest corporation. So this hospital chain has, nationwide presence. So we had a kind of a chief pharmacy officer at the top, and then you had multiple area or regional directors. So you had one cover the West, one cover the Central, one cover the East. And at each individual hospital site, you would have your directors of pharmacy, and this structure would happen for every level. So you'd have a CEO over the whole, organization. You'd have regional level CEOs, and you have CEOs at each individual hospital. So this was a very corporate structure. It's a very big hospital. It's for profit, for better, for worse. I worked at nonprofit and for profit. And, just being in this environment, it kind of taught me or showed me like how corporate healthcare looked like. And there's a bunch of pros and cons. So the pros, I would say, is that you kind of have to just follow a template. You follow a system. So the policies, for example, for the hospital were pretty much standardized. And because if you were in California, your laws are going to vary between maybe Texas, so you might have to slightly tweak some of the policies to fit your needs. But like 80% of the work was done already. You just have to do the 20% tweak depending on your local state laws. So that was nice. You had a regional director support. So if you're kind of like a newer director, like they would come in, they would kind of help onboard you, kind of help standardize you to be in line with every other hospital. In terms of like, inspections or surveys, if one hospital was surveyed in your region, usually they would share it with the other colleagues as to know what to expect, so you can be more proactive. So that was nice in terms of being that. And you kind of felt like you had other people to talk to, which I kind of felt like it was nice to have other directors of pharmacy to talk to, other people. So you kind of knew that you weren't alone, and you had your regional director kind of double check your work. And during these like inspections, the regional team would come and provide support at a higher level. So you kind of felt like you had help, you had support. So I think that part was definitely nice. The downside, I would say, of this corporate healthcare, the dark side, is that there's so many like dashboards and metrics that you must meet. So one big metric or dashboard was, okay, what's your labor budget? Were you over your labor budget based on the census of the hospital? So obviously if the hospital census is low, let's just say if your average census is 80, to fit your current staffing model, if the census drops down to 50, you had to flex some of your staff. So maybe they would leave a few hours earlier. So they would leave a few hours earlier. So instead of doing an 8-hour shift, they would do a 6-hour shift, or you might just consolidate a shift because census is lower. So every single month we had a metric dashboard, which is the dark side. And if you didn't hit your metric, you had to basically justify to the chief financial officer as to why you didn't hit it, what happened, and what are you going to do moving forward to make sure you hit it. So that's one thing. And then another thing was, hitting your drug budget. So a big thing for pharmacy leadership is making sure that we hit our drug budget, make sure that we don't over order medication, making sure that we, try to be, financially responsible. So sometimes you have to ask for justification as to why a doctor is using a medication that's not typically used in the hospital. So it's called a non-formulary medication. And typically whatever's on formulary is going to be more cost effective. But sometimes you have to go non-formulary because maybe a patient failed therapy on the formulary and they need an alternative medication. So typically there's an approval process. And then from there you bring in the medication. And why it's such a long approval process is because on the back end, pharmacy, we have to build the drug in the system so that the doctor can order it, so that we can, drop the charge on the patient. And, that takes a few days to build. So typically we try to discourage non-formulary medication, but, if they need it, they need it. So we'll bring it on. Our drug budget is a metric based on the patient census once again. So they might just say, okay, we think the average cost for each patient per day is $100 per patient day. So, once again, it's a metric. So, if we went over the budget, it's typically caused by like 1 or 2 medications. So 20% of your medications create for 80% of your drug cost, because you can buy one medication, it's like $30,000. And if your drug budget is $100,000 a month, like just one drug accounted for 30% of your drug budget. So that's unfortunately how it is. But it's kind of a game. So some months you're under budget. So if I'm under budget, I'm going to stock up on a medication that I know I'm going to use next month. But if I'm over drug budget, then obviously we'll kind of not buy as much or wait until the next month before we buy that medication, assuming that we have enough stock. So it really forces you to do inventory management, with that. So, that's kind of the dark side, is like it's death by 1,000 metrics. And anyone that works in like CVS, Walgreens, there's like certain metrics as well, like how many prescriptions are you doing, how many flu shots are you giving, what's your average time to pick up the phone. Like it's so many metrics, and that kind of, after a while, it kind of feels old, if I'm being honest. Like, it's great that I was there for a bit, a few years, but after a while it just gets very old, and you can't deviate from the system in the process. So like you're basically a cog in the system, and once you're in that system, it's really hard to deviate because they have to standardize amongst 50 hospitals. So I get it, you can't get really creative. Like that's what people say is working for Kaiser, is that you literally just follow the playbook and you cannot deviate the playbook, and you execute the playbook, and that's it. So for somebody who is more out of the box thinker like myself, they're not really open to that idea unless it works on a regional level. And there's just so much like bureaucracy, like just making one small change, which you think would be easy, is like a pain in the butt, because it has to go through many hoops and hurdles and layers and red tape. And by the time it gets approved, it's like not even worth it anymore. So, it's a great place to go if you just kind of want to chill and just follow the system. But if you want to like make massive change, massive impact, most likely you can't in that type of environment, just because it's so corporate. So that's kind of a dark side of it, is just so many metrics, can't really change the system, but there is a system there, so you don't have to reinvent the system. So to each their own. So like I said, there's definitely pros and cons to working in corporate America. And a lot of times you were held accountable for metrics. So like they would, you go on like these calls and they'd be like, oh, at this hospital you were under your metric, great. This hospital you're over your metric, what are you gonna do to improve? And here are some things that you have to implement. So like there's no choice, right? Like they said, okay, this is our initiative that we're doing, and you have to do it, like regardless if you agree or disagree with the initiative. So you kind of lose that flexibility. And with corporate healthcare, it's very, very, especially for profit, very conscious based. So if times are tough, money is tough, and they didn't hit their metrics, and maybe the stocks don't look as good, then they're gonna lay off some staff, or trim some services. And what I didn't like about my experience in the super corporate hospital is that they weren't focused on making the hospital better, more efficient. Like we had a very antiquated electronic health record, EHR, and then we didn't even have like any medication automation like Pyxis or Omnicell. So everything was like super, super manual. And they weren't motivated to like implement this automation, which is pretty much a standard across all hospitals, because they didn't want to allocate the money, the time, the resources to do that, and rather just shoot the money towards the shareholders. But this is kind of like standard stuff, right? It's not like groundbreaking technology. It's pretty standard, and it's sad because they don't want to reinvest the money to make it better, but they just want to reinvest the money so that the negative side is these corporate people who are based on bonuses get a nice raise, the shareholders are happy. And another dark side of corporate America is that a lot of times like venture capital or private equity is involved. So like I remember when I worked for this corporate company, the hospital was sold literally like 3 times to different private equity groups. So what they would do is that they would just like infuse money into there to hopefully raise the value. So maybe they would infuse, I'm just making easy numbers here, like $1 million into this hospital in hopes that it could generate $3 million more in revenue. And then that $3 million would have a 10x multiple. So it'd be worth, $30 million more. They would then flip it to the next private equity firm or venture capital firm. And the downside of this is every time they brought on a new venture capital firm, they would relook at the financials. They would see, okay, do we want to trim? Do we want to keep? Do we want to expand? And they have different initiatives. And so it's just kind of annoying that like maybe under a year, you're under this ownership and they sell you to another ownership, and now you have to change and pivot to what they want to do because they're the new owners. And a lot of times when you sell a hospital, they want to bring in their own leadership. So maybe the regional directors that you worked with are no longer there. Maybe they got laid off. And now they're going to bring in their own regional leadership, and now you have to rebuild trust with someone brand new, right? Like maybe I spent all this time, energy, and effort to build trust with my current regional director, and then the company gets bought out. They bring in their own regional director, and at that point, you have to rebuild the trust, and they have different initiatives and goals and objectives. So it's just kind of like you're constantly having to prove yourself, show your worth, show what you've done, show you accomplished, and give historical context. So it just requires a little bit more work in that. And like I said, it's a for-profit institution. So it's kind of funny, like I look back at the hospital today, and once again it's the same story. They're continuing to sell, and they're not focused on improving the system at all. Like I've heard multiple times they want to upgrade the electronic health system back in 2017, and fast forward 10 years later, they still haven't upgraded the electronic health records. It's still the same system. So like I said, they're not very motivated to improve it because they're just focused on appeasing the shareholders. So they're really focused on admitting more patients and then discharging the patients in a timely fashion to kind of maximize their profit and their reimbursement. So that was the huge focus. And for pharmacy, I was just focused on like making sure my labor budget was in check, and then making sure that my drug budget was not over. So that's all I was doing every single month, and it felt just very very repetitive and felt very soul sucking. So it's kind of the dark side of working in corporate healthcare, and CVS, Walgreens is like no different, right? There's so many metrics there. Like you're forced to give a bunch of flu vaccines, you're forced to pick up the phone within a certain time window, and they look at your metrics, and then the regional director will come down and yell at you, and at the same time they want to make sure that you have no complaints. But obviously if you're being pushed to the limit, and there's always going to be one unhappy customer at CVS or Walgreens, and they'll launch a complaint, and they'll come down and basically the regional director will give you a hard time about why there's a complaint. But if you service 300 people a day, like good chance 1%, which would be 3, will be unsatisfied, and they're gonna launch a complaint. I remember being the intern at Rite Aid, and there's always this one customer that would complain every single month. So literally when they saw her, they would just send me there just to listen to her. And then, because they knew nothing's gonna be done, but they just want me to listen to her. And I just remember they'd just say, oh, tell her like, she's not, happy with our service to, she can transfer to any pharmacy she wants to. But every month she comes back, complains. So maybe she just likes coming in and complaining every single month, right? Because we literally offered, hey, we can transfer your scripts. Where do you want to go? We can help facilitate that. if you're not happy with our service. But I don't know, maybe she had a bunch of things going on in her personal life and she just wanted to talk to a free therapist, aka a pharmacist. So a lot of times when you work in CVS and Rite Aid, Walgreens, you are a free therapist for the public because they just want to lash at you and give you a hard time. So most likely this person's miserable behind the scenes. It is what it is. Joys of working in healthcare, corporate America, and with that. So that's my experience working in a huge corporate hospital. Pros and cons, right? To each their own. My next one is I worked at a smaller corporation. So this one maybe has about 3 to 5 sister hospitals. So it's not really that big. So it's not a true corporate. And typically these are owned by like billionaire groups that want to invest in healthcare. So for example, that might be like Orange County Global Medical Center or KPC or AHMC. So these are typically owned by like rich billionaires. They made their money in some type of industry, whether it's business, whether it's real estate, whether it's development. They made a bunch of money in a way, and they want to like diversify. So they buy like hospitals, and they might accumulated like 3 to 5 hospitals. So these are typically managed by like these type of people. And this one, it's a little bit smaller, it's a little bit more intimate. So there typically will be a regional level leadership to help provide standardization. But from my experience, most hospitals, for the most part, operate as individual entities. So if you go between the 5 different hospitals, things will vary. But they try to standardize you in terms of like buying drugs, like the same drug formulary, because if you buy the same drug formulary, it's like going to Costco, you can buy in bulk, and it's cheaper if you buy in bulk versus if you buy, not in bulk. So they try to pull together these 5 hospitals to standardize how you buy your medications. And, once you do that, you have stronger purchasing power. It's called group purchasing organizations. And you get better rebates, you get better pricing to help control your drug costs because you're buying in bulk, right? Once again, it's like going to Costco, right? If you buy one, box of tissue, it's going to be more expensive versus you buy 100 boxes of tissue on a per box basis. It's going to be cheaper, but you have to buy in bulk or agree to buy in bulk. So this one, it's kind of like each of the hospital varies for the most part, but in terms of like what we buy, drug formula wise, we try to standardize that, and then you have the collegialness of like, hey, this hospital is hit by the inspector or the state inspector, and we would share what we learned. So this one was a nice hybrid. I kind of like that environment the best, to be honest, because you had other colleagues that you can bounce ideas off of. The formulary was consistent, but you weren't forced to be a cog in the system. Like you could have some variability to cater to your hospital versus like in the corporate corporate healthcare, big one that's nationwide, you couldn't do anything extra. You just had to do the playbook. But this one, you can kind of customize it. You had support from other people. You didn't have to reinvent the wheel. But the downside is that typically you're managed by, I would call them mom and pop billionaires. And they may or may not know how to run a hospital very well, right? They might have been very successful in real estate, for example, but doesn't mean, like, just because you're good at real estate doesn't mean you know how to like manage a hospital. It's a different skill set and a different mindset to do it. And unfortunately, I don't think hospitals, like, I would never invest in a hospital, if I'm being honest. Like, I think in my mind, the best case for a hospital is to like break even, right? Like, I don't think hospitals make money. Your best case is to break even. But if you're trying to make money from a hospital, I think you're better off just buying more real estate or doing a different type of investment, because hospitals, you don't make money. Best case, you break even, and the system is at the mercy of all this insurance and these pharmacy benefit managers and insurance. So basically, they can cut your insurance at any time, and all of a sudden your profitability just stagnates and drops big time. So like that's why I own my own pharmacy, and I didn't like it because I'm at the mercy of like Express Scripts or Blue Shield as to like how much money I get reimbursed, and it changes every single year. So I didn't like that. So like I said, I would never invest in a hospital. I think it's a dumb investment. You're better off just buying real estate. Just dump your money in the SP 500 and you're better off. It's more passive. But I get it. It's ultimate flex to be like, I own a hospital. I'm sure there's a lot of tax advantages to it, especially if it's a non-profit. and maybe there's just tax incentives that you get from the government. But like I said, I've seen so many people try to buy hospitals, try to make it work, and they end up like losing all their money, and they want to just sell the hospital and move on from it, because it's really a losing business, right? Like, you're not, in my mind, doing hospitals to like make money. You're just doing hospitals to take care of patients, and if you break even, like, that's good enough, right? Like for Kaiser, for example, which is an HMO, they probably break even best case on their hospital side, but where they make their money is on the insurance side, right? So they definitely make money on the insurance side. But the hospital, if they just break even, they're probably just like happy doing that, if I'm being honest. So another thing, working at this like mid-sized corporate, is that there are metrics. So you do have to like report out why you're over budget, why your drug budget's over there, but it's not like as intense, I would say. And there's a little more variability, like you have more control over what to do, versus like at the corporate, your hands are kind of tied. You don't really have as many options as to what to do. So I did kind of like this hybrid approach. That's probably the best place. But like I said, you're run by a bunch of billionaires, and then a lot of them, like sometimes, like what we kind of realize as you build wealth is like a lot of times people who are billionaires, they're like maybe not the smartest. Like some people, they just get lucky, right time, right place, put in the hustle, put in the grit, and they just kind of got lucky. But if you meet some billionaires, like some aren't like that smart once you meet them, right? Like you'll be surprised. Like sometimes people just got lucky, or sometimes just right time, right place, and right opportunity, and you put in the grind and you work. But you learn that people who are like good in business, a lot of times like they may not know much or may not be as intelligent as you think. So they're very emotional, and at a whim they'll just make like sudden changes that has a lot of downstream implications later. So that's the only annoying part. Like I remember working at a corporate environment, like it was kind of like very toxic, because people were afraid of pissing off the owner. And then, because if you piss off the owner, he's just gonna like fire you, right? Because he owns the hospitals. So I remember one day, out of nowhere, like we had a CEO, and then all of a sudden, out of the blue, this like chief operating officer started, and then no one knew that this guy was started. Even the CEO didn't know, because the owner just hired him out of nowhere, and he just showed up one day. And usually what that means is that, basically they had him on for 2-3 months, and then basically they fired the CEO out of the blue, and then all of a sudden the COO that came out of nowhere, took over. So most likely what they're doing was they hired him with the intent to take over, but wanting to give him 2-3 months to transition over from the current CEO. And then they just basically got rid of the CEO. So things like this happen more in these small corporate environments, or a lot of times, like the owners will hire a new leader at the corporate level, and then that new leader wants to bring in their own leadership team. So they'll typically, purge the C-suite. So they'll purge the CEO, the CFO, the COO, and then bring in someone new. And then that team, if they have like a pharmacy director, then they might want to like replace me, right? So that's kind of the downside of it. And so that's once again the pros and the cons, right? there's pros and cons to every single thing. And then I worked at Standalone hospital, so you're not under a corporation. And the good about this is that you can kind of do whatever you want. It's kind of choose your own adventure. You can choose your own journey. But the downside is that you don't have corporate support. Typically, you can either be really advanced, like if you have good leadership in place. So like they're like making things more progressive, making things more efficient. You can be very advanced standalone, but reality is most standalone hospitals are like very, very far behind. So typically they're going to be like 20 years behind, because they don't have the corporate structure, they don't have the corporate support, and a lot of times when you're left to your own devices and you're trying to just like think of solutions and you haven't worked anywhere else, like you just kind of like do a solution that you think is the best for your hospital, but then maybe like why not just follow the industry standard, right? Like if like 9 out of 10 hospitals are doing something, like why would you not kind of at least follow that trend? And why stick out? But I get it, when you're a standalone hospital, you kind of think that, oh well, we're different, we do things differently here, we're special, so we're not gonna follow this standard, but instead we're gonna do something else, which may be better, maybe worse, right? And a lot of times, for what I've seen, it's typically worse. So it's a little bit unstructured, unstandardized. You don't have, you know, regional support. You don't have any dashboards. It's kind of choose your own adventure. So it's really like I said, pros and cons, right? So it's nice where you have flexibility, but it's also not nice where people don't know what it's like. So let's just say you came from a corporate hospital, and all of a sudden you work at a standalone facility, and you're giving like suggestions, and like they just like don't take any of your suggestions because they think that you don't know anything, you don't know the hospital. So it's like you said, there's like pros and cons to every single thing. You know, every setting, right? So at the standalone, like I said, you need regional support. You're at the mercy of the skill set of the current employees. So they could be, if they're really strong, the hospital could be super progressive, super efficient. But if you have very weak employees, then, you know, it's probably very disorganized, very chaotic, and not very streamlined compared to other hospitals, right? So like I said, I've been in every type of setting, and there's pros and cons to this. Like some hospitals I worked at that are standalone, they're just like, there's no structure in place, there's no policies in place, things are dependent on people, and you can ask 10 different people how they do things, and you get 10 different responses, right? Versus if you work in a corporate, super corporate, you ask 10 different people, they'll give you the same response, because it's corporate. So like I said, there's definitely like pros and cons to every single thing, and you have to take the good or the bad, right? So like knowing all this information, so, you know, I talked about a super corporate hospital that's like nationwide. I talked about one where, you know, you own, you know, 5 hospitals, for example. And I talked about staying at a standalone hospital, and I talked about the pros and the cons. Curious to hear your thoughts, whether you worked in these environments and which environment you like the best. I would say, honestly, as a summation of this video, is that just work in whatever setting you like, but just the culture, right? So you have to like the culture of the people to be there. So I think for me, like I say, if you're in a corporate environment, it's a little bit more cutthroat, right? So if you're kind of at the hospital range where it's like 3 to 5 hospitals, and then hopefully you have people that are very competent running the hospital, because then that you can have like a really nice culture. Because I remember I worked at one hospital, and the culture was just so nice. Like everyone's like so pleasant. You know, you'd walk down the hallway, and you know, people would say hi. You know, people would know who your name is. And then I worked at a super corporate environment where like no one knows you. You walk down the hallway, no one will say hi. So it's just like, just pick a place that you can see yourself being in. Because like the grass isn't necessarily greener, if I'm being honest. So it's just really a matter of like what are you willing to put up with, right? What type of suckiness are you willing to put up with to determine, you know, where you work and all that. So, you know, curious to hear your thoughts as to where you would work, and share your dark side stories of working in corporate healthcare or working in corporate America. Would love to see and hear and learn from it. But anyways, hopefully you found some value. Drop your thoughts below. If you want to join my school community, please check it out. It's a 30 days. You can do 30. I'm sorry, this person's confused as to where to park. You can do my school community, where there's a bunch of real estate investors, a lot of wealth builders, and it's $30 a month, $1 a day. It's pretty affordable. And then if you want to buy my multifamily course, it's on multifamily. I lowered the price to $300. And excuse me, parked poorly. Lowered the price to $300, and you know, it's 100+ video modules on how to buy your first multifamily deal. So that's good. And then if you want to be connected to my mortgage broker, Andrew, or Lending One, just send me an email. I'm happy to connect you with that. If you want to use Steadily Landlord Insurance, punch in your address for free for your rental property. They'll give you a call next business day with a quote. Hopefully you save money, help me save money. And lastly, my email is my link tree. So all my links are my link tree down below. Otherwise, please like, comment, subscribe. Hope to see you tomorrow at 8 a.m. Pacific time, because I post every single day at 8 a.m. Pacific. Thank you so much and have a good day.